The moment the Betty bomber touched American soil, a hush fell over the hangar. Pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers circled the captured aircraft with a mix of awe, curiosity, and disbelief. Its sleek fuselage gleamed under the harsh lights, and yet there was a shocking flaw that made even seasoned pilots pause. The fuel tanks were left almost entirely unprotected. Eyes widened, breaths caught, and whispers filled the air. How could a plane designed for strategic bombing across vast Pacific distances be so vulnerable? Every pilot understood the stakes. One hit in the wrong place could turn a mighty bomber into a blazing inferno. Yet here it was, sitting silently, taunting them with its audacity and glaring oversight. The tension was palpable. Engineers traced their fingers along the metal, tapping panels, probing edges, noting rivets, seams, and the positions of fuel tanks. The pilots moved cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal that could strike at any moment. Even the veteran flyers who had faced enemy fire countless times exchanged incredulous glances. The Betty bomber had already wreaked havoc in the skies, yet now, exposed and silent on the tarmac, it seemed almost fragile. Its dangerous design choices were both confounding and terrifying, presenting a puzzle that demanded attention, analysis, and respect. Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Fletcher was among the first to approach the aircraft. His hands rested lightly on the cool metal, eyes scanning the fuselage, wings, and most crucially, the fuel tanks. Positioned externally in certain sections and only lightly armored in others, the tanks were a glaring vulnerability, a design decision that left him questioning Japanese engineering priorities, strategic reasoning, and tactical foresight. He motioned for his fellow pilots to observe, and a low murmur of discussion began, punctuated by sharp exclamations as men pointed out the numerous weak points. The initial inspection revealed the first layer of surprise. Despite being underpowered in protection, the Betty was remarkably sturdy in other ways. Its engines roared with a distinct hum during startup tests, revealing engineering choices that allowed for range, speed, and stability unmatched by earlier Allied estimates. Yet this revelation only deepened the mystery. Why prioritize endurance and payload while leaving critical fuel stores exposed? The contradiction became a central question, sparking debates among engineers and flyers that stretched long into the afternoon. Fletcher climbed cautiously onto the wing to inspect the bomb bay, noting the internal structure and placement of mechanisms that controlled payload release. The design was meticulous in its own right. Bomb racks were streamlined, and release systems were surprisingly efficient. Every technical observation added layers of complexity to the puzzle, brilliant in some respects, careless in others. The juxtaposition of innovation and vulnerability made the aircraft a study in contrasts, challenging every assumption American pilots held about Japanese aviation. By midday, small groups had formed around the Betty, each dissecting different aspects of its design. Engineers with clipboards sketched, measured, and compared notes, noting anomalies and peculiarities. Pilots ran their fingers along control surfaces, testing responsiveness, tension, and balance. It became clear that the Japanese had designed a bomber optimized for long-range missions, capable of delivering significant payloads, yet with a critical Achilles heel that could be exploited by experienced Allied crews. The discovery fueled excitement, strategy discussions, and a kind of nervous energy that electrified the hangar. Observers moved cautiously around the unprotected fuel tanks, discussing tactics, vulnerabilities, and potential engagement strategies. Each man recognized the lethal irony. The very aircraft that had eluded American defenses and wreaked havoc could be neutralized if hit in precisely the wrong spot. Engineers speculated about materials, armor thickness, and design rationale, while pilots considered altitude, approach vectors, and ammunition types that could maximize damage. The Betty became both a technical puzzle and a psychological challenge, a deadly enigma that demanded respect, understanding, and ingenuity. Fletcher paused by the fuselage, running a hand along the external fuel tanks, noting rivets, seams, and the thin panels that offered minimal protection. His mind raced, imagining the chaos that would ensue if one of these tanks were pierced mid-flight, fire spreading through wings, engines faltering, crews scrambling for survival. He could almost see it unfolding in slow motion, a nightmarish ballet of sparks, smoke, and terrified men. Yet amidst the danger lay opportunity. Knowledge of these vulnerabilities could turn the tide in future engagements, transforming fear into strategic advantage. Engineers sketched the tank positions, taking precise measurements and noting anomalies. Observers debated why such critical components had been left exposed. Some speculated that weight reduction was paramount, allowing longer range and heavier bomb loads. Others argued that manufacturing limitations and resource scarcity had forced compromises in design. Every theory carried implications for aerial combat tactics, pilot training, and the future of bomber engagements across the Pacific. Each hypothesis sparked new questions, creating a cascade of discovery that seemed endless. By late afternoon, the initial shock had transformed into determination. Pilots and engineers worked together, discussing potential combat scenarios, optimizing approach angles, and formulating strategies to exploit the aircraft's vulnerabilities. They studied diagrams, ran simulations, and debated endlessly over the mechanics of fire, fuel ignition, and explosive potential. The Betty, once a symbol of Japanese air dominance, had become a classroom for strategy, engineering, and survival. Every detail, from tank placement to wing construction, demanded attention, respect, and careful analysis. As the sun dipped low, shadows stretched across the hangar floor. The Betty sat silently, almost taunting those who had once feared it in combat. Yet the lessons it offered were invaluable. Intelligence, observation, and knowledge could convert a perceived threat into a tactical advantage. Every pilot left the hangar that evening with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of their adversary, and a chilling respect for the deadly potential of this aircraft. As night fell, Fletcher stood alone by the Betty, flashlight tracing the contours of its fuselage, engines, and exposed fuel tanks. He felt a shiver run through him. The realization that knowledge of these weaknesses could save countless lives in the skies, but also that any miscalculation could result in catastrophic loss. The shadows of war loomed large, yet here, in this quiet hangar, lay the blueprint for survival, innovation, and the mastery of a deadly opponent. Could the lessons of a single captured bomber redefine the future of aerial warfare? Could one man's understanding change the outcome of entire campaigns? The answer lay hidden in the exposed metal, waiting for those bold enough to seize it. The following morning, the hangar hummed with renewed energy. Pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers returned with clipboards, notebooks, and a shared sense of urgency. Lieutenant Fletcher, still shaken by the unprotected fuel tanks, led a small team to conduct a detailed structural analysis. Every panel, every rivet, every seam was scrutinized. The exposed tanks were examined from every conceivable angle, side, top, and bottom, revealing weaknesses that were both astonishing and dangerous. The realization struck every man with brutal clarity. If a single Allied fighter managed to hit these tanks mid-flight, the bomber could erupt into flames almost instantaneously. The Betty's engines, however, told a different story. Fletcher and his team marveled at the reliability and endurance built into the design. Despite its vulnerability, the aircraft was capable of long-range missions, carrying heavy bomb loads across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The pilots ran calculations, comparing fuel efficiency, payload, and speed to American bombers. The contrast was stark. While the Betty's design included glaring flaws, it also contained innovations that demanded respect. The duality of brilliance and negligence made every observation a lesson in both admiration and caution. By mid-morning, small groups of pilots began simulating attack scenarios. They discussed dive angles, ammunition selection, and wing positioning, all with the goal of exploiting the exposed tanks. Fletcher took meticulous notes, mapping every potential weakness, envisioning how Allied fighters could approach without alerting the bomber's crew prematurely. Every man knew that knowledge alone could decide the outcome of life-and-death aerial encounters. What had once been a terrifying adversary now became a blueprint for tactical superiority, yet the stakes remained perilously high. Engineers focused on structural integrity, testing sections of the wings and fuselage for stress tolerances. They measured armor thickness, noting that some areas were surprisingly thin, while others offered more protection than expected. Discussions erupted over why the Japanese had prioritized some areas and neglected others. Could weight distribution have been the main reason? Or was it a calculated risk, assuming certain sections would never be targeted effectively? Every hypothesis sparked new debates, each carrying significant implications for aerial engagement strategies. Fletcher climbed into the cockpit to examine instrumentation and controls. The layout was efficient yet unfamiliar, requiring rapid adaptation and understanding. Gauges, levers, and switches were observed in minute detail, revealing a design philosophy that emphasized pilot endurance and mechanical reliability despite the vulnerability of the fuel system. Every control was considered, every panel analyzed, as pilots imagined themselves navigating the Pacific skies, dodging flak, and delivering deadly payloads. The Betty had become a teacher, demonstrating that even flawed designs could challenge human ingenuity and strategic thinking. By noon, the hangar floor was filled with animated discussions. Pilots shared insights, speculated about enemy tactics, and debated the implications of unarmored fuel tanks. Some suggested precision strikes with .50 caliber rounds. Others advocated coordinated attacks from multiple angles. Fletcher observed each interaction, noting the evolution of thought, strategy, and collaboration. The captured bomber had transformed fear into focused analysis, panic into planning, and vulnerability into opportunity. Every officer left the conversation with new understanding, aware that this single aircraft could reshape Allied combat doctrine if its lessons were fully absorbed. In the afternoon, tests were conducted on mock-up fuel tanks, simulating hits with various ammunition types. Sparks flew, flames erupted, and the destructive potential of a single shot became terrifyingly evident. Pilots watched intently, calculating angles, velocities, and probabilities. The Betty's dangerous flaw had been confirmed. These tanks were a tinderbox in the wrong hands. Yet the analysis also inspired confidence. Knowledge of weaknesses offered a chance to dominate the skies. Provided every decision, movement, and shot was executed with precision. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the hangar. Fletcher stood before the Betty, flashlight tracing the fuselage and exposed fuel tanks, imagining the chaos that would unfold if an enemy pilot encountered this bomber unprepared. Yet he also envisioned a different outcome, Allied fighters exploiting these weaknesses, turning fear into opportunity, and leveraging knowledge to save countless lives. The aircraft, once a symbol of enemy dominance, had been transformed into a case study in strategy, observation, and human ingenuity. As darkness fell over the hangar, the Betty sat silent, almost mocking in its deadly elegance. The pilots and engineers departed one by one, their minds racing with calculations, tactics, and strategies. Could these exposed fuel tanks truly determine the outcome of future battles? Would knowledge of this weakness tip the balance in favor of the Allies, or would misjudgment result in catastrophic losses? The answer lay hidden in the metallic contours of the bomber, waiting for those bold enough to seize it and smart enough to understand its deadly secrets. The night whispered promises of revelations yet to come, of lessons that would echo across the skies, and of strategies forged from observation, daring, and intellect. The next morning, the hangar was alive with renewed urgency. Pilots returned, clipboards in hand, eager to analyze every nuance of the captured Betty bomber. Lieutenant Fletcher led the team through a meticulous inspection of the fuselage, wings, and, most critical of all, the unprotected fuel tanks. Each rivet, seam, and panel was studied with precision, and the exposed nature of the tanks elicited murmurs of disbelief. The very design that enabled the Betty to traverse hundreds of miles unscathed also made it vulnerable to a single, well-placed strike. Engineers and pilots alike were confronted with the paradox, brilliance intertwined with deadly oversight. A machine designed to dominate yet simultaneously fragile in the wrong hands. Fletcher climbed carefully along the wing, examining the bomb bay and control surfaces. The mechanisms were efficient, streamlined, and deceptively simple, yet their placement demonstrated strategic foresight. The juxtaposition of the exposed fuel tanks and the ingenuity of the bomb deployment systems created a cognitive dissonance among observers. How could a bomber capable of such precise operations leave such critical vulnerabilities exposed? Discussions erupted among pilots and engineers, each theory more complex than the last. Some suggested weight distribution concerns, others proposed manufacturing limitations or resource constraints. Every hypothesis deepened the understanding that the Betty was both a masterpiece and a hazard, a duality that demanded careful study and respect. By mid-morning, small groups began simulating attack approaches. They ran calculations on angles, speeds, and ammunition types, plotting hypothetical engagements that would exploit the aircraft's weak points. Fletcher observed as pilots tested approaches from multiple directions, considering altitude, timing, and positioning. Every detail was critical. A single miscalculation could lead to disaster in real combat. The Betty, silent on the tarmac, became a classroom for aerial strategy, a silent instructor teaching lessons in vulnerability, precision, and the lethal consequences of oversight. Engineers focused on the integrity of the wings and fuselage. Sections were tested for stress, revealing surprising resilience in some areas and shocking fragility in others. Conversations became debates. Debates turned into heated discussions about Japanese priorities, design rationale, and battlefield strategy. Each measurement, each observation, contributed to a growing body of knowledge that could inform future Allied tactics. The Betty had evolved from an enemy aircraft into a living laboratory, a source of insight, and a symbol of the delicate balance between innovation and recklessness. Fletcher climbed into the cockpit once more, inspecting instruments, gauges, and controls with painstaking attention. Every lever, every switch, every panel told a story of engineering philosophy and operational intent. The design emphasized pilot endurance, mechanical reliability, and mission efficiency, yet remained dangerously exposed to catastrophic failure. Pilots imagined themselves in the cockpit, navigating hostile skies, aware that a single strike could ignite the tanks and engulf the aircraft in flames. The tension was palpable, and each man felt the weight of responsibility. Understanding this enemy machine was not just academic, it was essential for survival. By noon, discussions shifted to tactical engagement. Pilots debated the most effective ways to exploit the exposed tanks, weighing the pros and cons of different approaches. Some advocated head-on attacks, others suggested strafing from above or below. Ammunition selection became a critical factor, with 50 caliber rounds identified as potentially devastating if aimed precisely. Every scenario was analyzed, critiqued, and refined, each iteration increasing the team's comprehension of the bomber's vulnerabilities. What had been a terrifying instrument of Japanese power now represented a tactical advantage if approached with strategy, discipline, and precision. In the afternoon, mock-up fuel tanks were subjected to controlled strikes to simulate the effects of combat. Sparks flew, flames erupted, and the destructive power of a single well-placed shot became evident. Pilots observed with intense focus, calculating angles, distances, and potential outcomes. The simulations reinforced the lessons learned from observation. Knowledge of weaknesses was as critical as combat skill, and preparation could turn fear into opportunity. The Betty had become a teacher in ways the pilots could never have imagined, demonstrating that understanding vulnerabilities was as essential as recognizing strengths. As the sun set, Fletcher stood before the bomber, flashlight illuminating the contours of the fuselage and the exposed tanks. He envisioned the chaos that could erupt in combat, the potential loss of life, and the critical importance of strategy and precision. Yet he also saw opportunity. By studying, understanding, and planning, the same weaknesses that had once terrified Allied pilots could be transformed into decisive advantages. The aircraft, once a symbol of fear, had become a roadmap for success, a testament to the power of intelligence, observation, and calculated risk. As night enveloped the hangar, the Betty sat silent and imposing, almost taunting those who studied it. Every detail examined, every hypothesis considered, and every simulated attack conducted was a step closer to mastery. Could the exposed fuel tanks ultimately dictate the fate of battles to come? Would the lessons gleaned from this single aircraft reshape Allied strategy across the Pacific? And most chillingly, could one miscalculation in applying this knowledge result in catastrophe? The answers lay within the bomber's cold metal frame, waiting for those brave and astute enough to turn insight into survival and dominance. The next morning, the hangar buzzed with an energy that bordered on reverent curiosity. Pilots and engineers returned with renewed determination, their minds sharpened by the revelations of previous inspections. Lieutenant Fletcher led a focused team to examine the Betty's fuel tanks and fuselage, intent on uncovering every hidden vulnerability. Each rivet, seam, and panel was inspected with painstaking care. The exposed tanks loomed as a stark contrast to the otherwise sophisticated engineering, a paradox that fascinated and horrified in equal measure. Observers whispered among themselves, each contemplating the deadly potential of a single misstep in combat and the equally potent advantage if this knowledge could be applied effectively. Fletcher and his team climbed onto the wings, tracing the contours of the aircraft with gloved hands, noting the positioning of fuel lines, access panels, and support brackets. The bomb bay, meticulously engineered for efficiency, seemed almost to mock the dangerous simplicity of the external tanks. Engineers debated whether the placement of armor was a deliberate prioritization of weight reduction or an oversight born from a lack of foresight. Each theory was examined rigorously, evidence weighed against probability, with discussions escalating into complex strategic debates. The Betty had become more than an aircraft. It had become a living case study in innovation, risk, and the contradictions inherent in wartime engineering. By mid-morning, small groups of pilots ran hypothetical attack scenarios, moving through simulations with methodical precision. Fletcher observed the formations, noting approach angles, altitude considerations, and target priorities. Every calculation, every measurement was intended to maximize the effectiveness of potential strikes on the exposed fuel tanks while minimizing risk to Allied pilots. The Betty, silent on the tarmac, served as both teacher and adversary, challenging every assumption and forcing a recalibration of aerial strategy. Observers realized that the lessons learned here could not only neutralize the bomber in future encounters, but also influence broader tactics across the Pacific theater. Engineers focused on structural analysis, testing the wings, fuselage, and bomb racks for strength and resilience. Measurements revealed areas of surprising sturdiness juxtaposed against alarming vulnerability, particularly in the sections containing unprotected fuel. Debates arose regarding Japanese design philosophy. Were these compromises calculated risks to achieve range and payload capacity, or misjudgments born of inexperience or resource limitations? Each hypothesis prompted further investigation, compelling pilots and engineers alike to rethink established assumptions and consider new approaches to aerial engagement. Fletcher climbed into the cockpit again, methodically reviewing controls, instrumentation, and mechanisms. Every dial, lever, and switch was scrutinized, revealing a design philosophy that prioritized operational efficiency and pilot endurance. Yet the exposed fuel tanks remained an inescapable hazard. Pilots imagined themselves navigating enemy skies, aware that a single, precise hit could ignite catastrophe. The tension was tangible. The responsibility of understanding these vulnerabilities weighed heavily on every observer. What had once been a source of fear now offered a path to strategic mastery, if approached with knowledge, discipline, and courage. By noon, simulations and discussions shifted toward practical applications. Teams debated the most effective angles of attack, ammunition choices, and timing to exploit the Betty's weaknesses. Every theory was tested mentally, every approach analyzed and refined. The bomber, once a feared instrument of Japanese air power, had been transformed into a blueprint for Allied advantage. Pilots left the discussions energized, aware that intelligence combined with precise execution could turn the tide of battle, converting fear into calculated opportunity. In the afternoon, mock fuel tanks were subjected to controlled strikes, demonstrating the lethal potential of exposed design. Sparks, smoke, and flames erupted in dramatic succession, vividly illustrating the destructive consequences of hitting the tanks. Pilots and engineers observed intently, noting angles, impact points, and reaction patterns. The exercise underscored a critical truth. Knowledge of weaknesses could spell the difference between survival and annihilation. The Betty had become a teacher in unexpected ways, its design flaws offering lessons in strategy, foresight, and the lethal precision required in aerial combat. As the sun descended, casting elongated shadows across the hangar, Fletcher stood alone before the bomber. His flashlight traced the lines of fuselage, wing, and the exposed fuel tanks. He visualized the chaos that might unfold in combat, the potential for devastation, and the critical importance of strategy and preparation. Yet he also glimpsed the opportunity embedded within these vulnerabilities, a chance to turn a feared enemy into a tactical advantage. The aircraft, silent and imposing, symbolized both threat and opportunity, demanding respect, careful study, and calculated action. As night fell, the Betty sat quietly in the hangar, seemingly observing the pilots and engineers who had spent the day studying it. Every rivet, seam, and unprotected panel whispered secrets of survival and destruction. Could these vulnerabilities truly determine the outcome of battles yet to come? Would Allied pilots, armed with this knowledge, dominate the skies, or would miscalculations lead to disaster? The answers lay hidden in the aircraft's exposed metal frame, waiting for those bold and perceptive enough to transform insight into decisive action, to convert observation into mastery, and to wield knowledge as a weapon against the chaos of war. The next morning, the hangar was alive with anticipation and a focused intensity that bordered on reverence. Pilots, engineers, and intelligence officers returned, their minds sharpened by the lessons of the previous days. Lieutenant Fletcher gathered the team for a final, detailed inspection of the Betty bomber's most critical vulnerabilities: the exposed fuel tanks and their integration with the overall aircraft design. Each rivet, panel, and seam was scrutinized under bright lights, the metallic gleam reflecting off the polished floors, revealing imperfections, design intentions, and potential hazards. Every observer understood the lethal stakes. One misstep in understanding or execution could have catastrophic consequences in combat. Fletcher led a careful examination of the wings, tracing every line, every control surface, and every junction where fuel lines connected to the engines. Engineers measured armor thickness and cross-referenced it with prior calculations, uncovering inconsistencies that both intrigued and alarmed them. They debated the balance between durability, weight, and operational efficiency, trying to reconstruct the Japanese design philosophy in their own minds. Every insight sparked new questions. Was the decision to leave fuel tanks exposed deliberate, or a product of necessity and compromise? Could this oversight be exploited without exposing Allied pilots to undue risk? By mid-morning, simulations intensified. Pilots ran tactical exercises, moving through hypothetical attack scenarios designed to exploit the exposed tanks while accounting for the bomber's strengths. Fletcher observed as each approach was analyzed. Dive angles, altitude, speed, and ammunition type, all calculated with painstaking precision. Every man understood the gravity of the knowledge they were acquiring. It could save lives, tip the balance of battles, and redefine engagement strategies across the Pacific. The Betty, once a symbol of fear, had transformed into a teacher, demonstrating that careful observation, rigorous analysis, and disciplined execution could convert vulnerability into advantage. Engineers focused on stress tests of the wings, fuselage, and internal mechanisms. Areas of unexpected resilience were compared with fragile sections to understand load distribution, material strength, and operational priorities. Discussions flared over why certain design decisions were made: weight reduction for longer range, limitations in material availability, or calculated risk based on anticipated engagement scenarios. Every detail, every speculation, became part of a broader understanding that would inform Allied tactics and training. The Betty was no longer merely an enemy aircraft. It had become a repository of strategic and technical knowledge, offering lessons that could not be ignored. Fletcher climbed into the cockpit to review controls, instruments, and instrumentation panels. Every lever engaged told a story of design philosophy and operational intent, revealing the thought process of Japanese engineers. Pilots imagined themselves navigating the aircraft under combat conditions, aware that a single well-placed strike on the exposed fuel tanks could ignite disaster. The tension in the hangar was palpable. The stakes were no longer theoretical. Knowledge of the bomber's flaws became a matter of life and death. Understanding these vulnerabilities required not only technical skill, but imagination, strategic foresight, and courage. By noon, teams were refining attack plans based on observed weaknesses. Discussions ranged from optimal attack angles to precise ammunition selection. The exposed fuel tanks, a glaring flaw, had become the centerpiece of tactical planning. Each scenario was critiqued and recalibrated, integrating lessons from structural analysis, pilot simulations, and mock strikes on replicated fuel tanks. Sparks flew, smoke curled, and the lethal potential of a single strike was dramatized in real time. Observers could see the consequences vividly. One well-aimed shot could incapacitate the bomber, saving countless Allied lives and turning fear into strategic advantage. The afternoon brought focused simulation exercises, where pilots moved through complex attack maneuvers designed to exploit every vulnerability of the Betty. They imagined themselves in the cockpit of Allied fighters, dodging defensive fire while targeting the critical fuel tanks. The exercises were intense, requiring split-second calculations, precise coordination, and complete trust in accumulated knowledge. Engineers monitored these drills closely, offering feedback and recalculating probabilities. Every movement, every observation, and every adjustment reinforced the principle that understanding the enemy was as critical as raw firepower in determining victory or survival. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the hangar floor, Fletcher paused to consider the profound implications of the day's work. The Betty, in all its deadly elegance, represented both peril and opportunity. Knowledge of its vulnerabilities provided a strategic edge, yet any miscalculation could result in disaster. The team had uncovered lessons not only about Japanese engineering but about human ingenuity, strategy, and the unpredictable interplay between brilliance and oversight. The aircraft had transformed from a feared adversary into a repository of tactical intelligence, a symbol of how observation, analysis, and daring could convert fear into mastery. As darkness settled over the hangar, the Betty sat silent, its metallic frame glinting faintly in the dim light. Every panel, seam, and exposed tank whispered secrets of survival, destruction, and opportunity. Could these weaknesses truly change the course of aerial engagements? Would Allied pilots, armed with this knowledge, dominate the skies or falter under the pressures of execution? And most chillingly, could a single error nullify the advantage entirely? The answers lay within the bomber's deadly yet instructive design, waiting for those brave and meticulous enough to turn observation into strategy, calculation into survival, and insight into decisive victory.